Rain hammered the black windows of Il Cigno Bianco, like fists demanding entry, but nothing entered this room without permission. Not the storm, not the police, not even God, some said. On the nights Domenico Moretti dined here. The private dining room sat 2 floors beneath a nondescript Italian restaurant in Lower Manhattan, hidden behind a wine cellar door that only opened for the right knock. Inside, dark mahogany walls swallowed the low golden light. Crystal glasses caught the glow and threw it back in fractured little stars. White tablecloths lay pressed so crisp they looked like snow that had never been touched. 6 men in tailored suits sat at the edges of the room, sipping espresso, pretending to be businessmen. They were not businessmen. Their jackets hung a half-inch too loose on the left side, tailored to hide the weight of a holster. At the center table, beneath a single low chandelier, sat Domenico Moretti. He was 36 years old, though his eyes looked older, the way a winter looks older than the season before it. Dark hair combed back, without a strand out of place, a jaw carved sharp enough to cut. His charcoal suit fit him, the way silence fits a room right before something breaks it. He did not fidget. He did not raise his voice. Men far more dangerous than the ones in this room had learned that Domenico's stillness was the most dangerous thing about him. Puccini's Tosca drifted from the restaurant's vintage sound system, low and mournful, curling through the cigar smoke like a ghost that refused to leave. Beside him sat Camilla Russo. She was beautiful in the practiced way, sculpted cheekbones, a black dress that cost more than most people's rent, diamonds at her throat that caught the chandelier light and threw it around like she wanted the whole room to notice her instead of the music. She noticed neither the storm nor the opera. She noticed that Domenico's attention was somewhere else. God, can we turn this off? Camilla said, waving a manicured hand toward the ceiling speakers. It's just screeching. I don't understand why anyone pays money for this. Domenico's jaw tightened, just slightly. A man who did not know him would have missed it entirely. That is Maria Callas, he said quietly. Whoever she is, she sounds like she's being murdered. Camilla laughed, a bright, careless sound that didn't belong in this room. Honestly, Domenico, anyone could yell like that if they wanted to. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 2 degrees. One of the men near the wall shifted his weight, eyes flicking toward his boss. Domenico did not answer. He picked up his wineglass instead, and that silence was worse than any shout. That was the moment the door opened, and Beatrice Hughes walked in with a crystal decanter of Barolo balanced against her forearm. She was 28 years old. 260 pounds distributed across a broad-shouldered frame, thick through the waist, heavy in the hips, with legs that had carried trays and endured double shifts for 6 years without complaint. Her uniform had been custom-tailored. The restaurant didn't stock her size, a small daily reminder that the world had not been built with room for her. Her feet ached inside her shoes. They always did, by hour 6. She kept her chin low, eyes on the floor, then the table, then the glass, never on the faces. She had learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, in a dozen restaurants before this one. Pour the wine, smile, look down, leave. It was not a rule she had written down anywhere. It was a rule burned into her, the way a scar becomes part of the skin. She reached Camilla's side of the table and tilted the decanter toward the glass. Camilla moved her arm at exactly the wrong moment, reaching for her phone, or pretending to, and her elbow caught Beatrice's wrist. The decanter tipped. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth in a spreading stain, dark as a wound. and a few crimson drops splattered across the hem of Camilla's ivory silk dress. "Oh my God!" Camilla shot up from her chair, knocking it back with a screech against the floor. "Are you kidding me? I'm so sorry." Beatrice's voice came out barely above a whisper, already bracing. "You clumsy." Camilla's eyes raked over her, top to bottom, with the particular cruelty of someone who had been waiting all night for an excuse. "God, of course. Look at the size of you. How do you even fit between the tables?" A few of the men at the edges of the room looked down at their espresso cups, suddenly very interested in them. "This dress cost $11,000, Camilla snapped. "You're going to pay for it." "Actually, no. You're going to lose your job. That's what's going to happen. Women like you shouldn't even be allowed to work somewhere like this. You're unappetizing. Do you understand that? People come here to eat, and they have to look at that walking around." Beatrice lowered her head another inch. Her hands trembled around the decanter's neck. This was the part where she apologized, where she promised to pay for the cleaning, where she braced for the manager to appear and quietly tell her not to bother coming back Thursday. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she said. "I'll cover the cost of—" "You'll do more than that. You'll—" Domenico raised one hand. He did not raise his voice. He did not even raise his eyes from the ruined tablecloth at first, but the room went silent as if someone had reached out and switched it off. Camilla stopped mid-sentence. Slowly, Domenico looked up. Not at the wine stain, not at Camilla's dress. He looked at Beatrice first, a long, unreadable study of her face, the way she stood braced for impact, the way her eyes refused to meet his. Then his gaze shifted to Camilla. "You insulted my music," he said, voice low and even. "You insulted my table, and now you insult my staff. Domenico, she ruined my— I don't care about the dress." He said it flatly, like a fact of physics. "I care that you sat at my table tonight and told me that anyone could sing what Maria Callas sang, that anyone could carry what that woman carried in her voice." His eyes flicked, just briefly, back to Beatrice. "You think talent is common, that greatness is easy, that anyone could do it if only they tried. I just meant, let's test that theory." He reached into his jacket. The men near the wall straightened, almost imperceptibly, hands drifting a half-inch closer to their sides. Domenico withdrew a matte black pistol and set it in the center of the table, directly atop the spreading red stain, against the white linen. Black gun, red wine, white cloth. The image seared itself into the room like a photograph nobody would ever forget. Beatrice's breath caught. The decanter shook in her grip. Domenico did not point the gun at anyone. He simply let it sit there, a promise of what this table was capable of, while every man in the room understood exactly what it meant. He looked at Beatrice. "What is your name?" Beatrice," she stammered. "Beatrice Hughes." Domenico studied her another long moment. Then he turned back to Camilla, and something dark and amused moved behind his eyes. "Then let us test your theory, Camilla," he said. "If this woman, this waitress you just called unappetizing, this woman you think incapable of anything, can sing Puccini's Visi Dart flawlessly right now, in this room, I will marry her." The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down on the chandelier light, on the wine-soaked cloth, on the black gun resting between them. Camilla let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." "I never joke at this table." Domenico's eyes didn't leave Beatrice. "And if she refuses, or if she fails, you will explain to your father exactly why his debt to my family just became considerably more difficult to negotiate." Camilla's laughter died in her throat. Beatrice felt the floor tilt beneath her. She understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that this was no longer about spilled wine. Somewhere out there, a man she had never met, Camilla's father, had a debt and a life, and that life was now balanced on Beatrice's throat. She closed her eyes. "You don't know what you're asking," she wanted to say. "You don't know what this song used to mean to me. You don't know what it cost me to stop singing it." But she did know one thing. She could not let another person pay for her fear. She set the decanter down on the sideboard with hands that would not stop shaking. And then, for the first time in 10 years, Beatrice Hughes took a singer's breath. It was different from an ordinary breath. Lower, rooted somewhere beneath the ribs, drawn all the way down into the body the world had spent years telling her to make smaller. She let her shoulders drop. She let her weight settle into her feet. The same feet that ached from 6 years of carrying trays, now planted like foundations. She opened her mouth. Visi dart, visi d'amore. The first note cracked the room open like a struck bell. It was not the trembling, apologetic sound anyone expected from a frightened waitress. It was full-bodied, dark and golden, a dramatic soprano's voice that filled every mahogany corner of the room and did not ask permission to be there. The crystal glasses on the table shivered, a fine and eerie vibration as the note climbed. One of the bodyguards near the door slowly lowered the hand that had drifted toward his jacket. He didn't seem to notice he'd done it. Lorenzo, Domenico's underboss, seated near the far wall, a heavy-set man with a face like carved stone, sat forward in his chair, eyes narrowing, utterly still. Camilla's face drained of color. Her mouth opened slightly and stayed that way. Beatrice sang of a woman who had lived for art, lived for love, and asked her God why, after everything she had given, she had been abandoned in her hour of need. She had sung this aria once before, years ago, for an audition that would have changed her life. Before the fire, before the debts, before the silence that swallowed her whole. Now the words meant something different. Now every syllable carried 10 years of grief she had never been allowed to grieve. Her father's face, the warehouse in flames, the eviction notices, the mirrors she had stopped looking into, the uniform tailored special because the world hadn't made room for her. All of it poured out through her voice, and it did not sound like performance. It sounded like survival. Domenico had sat in private boxes at the Metropolitan Opera. He had flown to Milan for opening night at La Scala. He had heard the finest voices money could summon. He had never heard anything like this. Something in his expression, the permanent, practiced control he wore like a second suit, cracked open, just slightly, just for a moment. Only Beatrice was close enough to see. She reached the climax of the aria, the desperate plea rising toward its peak, and her voice did not waver, did not crack, did not apologize for the space it filled. It commanded the room the way Domenico himself commanded it. Except this was not fear, this was awe. The final note hung in the air and slowly, achingly, faded into silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Domenico rose from his chair. He crossed the room slowly, past the wine-stained tablecloth, past the black gun still resting where he'd left it, and stopped directly in front of Beatrice. Up close, she could see that his eyes, cold, dark, and terrifyingly controlled a moment ago, had changed. There was something almost unguarded in them now. "What is your name?" he asked again, softer this time. "Beatrice," she whispered. He reached for her hand, her calloused, work-ruined hand, the hand of a woman who carried trays for a living, and pressed his lips against her knuckles. "I am a man of my word," Domenico said. He turned toward the men at the wall. "Get her out of my sight," he said, nodding once toward Camilla, who was already being escorted, ashen-faced and silent, from the room. Then he looked back at Beatrice. "Quit this job. I? What? You heard me." A faint, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth. "We have a wedding to plan." Every soldier in the room believed, in that moment, that they were witnessing a fairy tale. A mafia king, bewitched by an unexpected voice, about to elevate a forgotten waitress into a queen. They did not see what happened next, because Domenico had already turned away, already begun speaking to Lorenzo about arrangements, about security, about 100 small details that would follow a wedding this sudden. They did not see Beatrice's face change. Fear did not leave her expression, but something else moved beneath it, sharp, cold, and calculating. Because Beatrice Hughes was not her real name. Her name was Beatrice Romano. And for 10 years, she had believed that the Moretti family murdered her father. She had taken this job 8 months ago, after learning, through a contact who owed her a favor, through a whispered name in a bar in Bensonhurst, that Domenico Moretti occasionally dined at Il Cigno Bianco on Tuesday nights. She had memorized his face from old photographs. She had studied every rumor about his habits, his temper, his obsession with opera. She had planned to get close enough to observe him, to learn his patterns, to find some thread that would lead her to the truth about her father's death. She had never, not in her wildest calculations, expected a marriage wager. But as Domenico turned his back to her, already discussing wedding logistics with his underboss like it was a business acquisition, Beatrice felt something shift inside her chest, cold and sharp, as a blade sliding free of its sheath. "Marry me, Domenico Moretti. She thought, watching the line of his shoulders, the easy authority in his voice. "Take me into your mansion. Give me your name. Give me access to every locked door in your empire. I will find the black ledger everyone whispers about. And I will burn what's left of you to the ground." The apartment in Queens had roaches that came out after midnight like clockwork. The radiator clanked and rarely worked. The walls were thin enough that Beatrice could hear her neighbors' television arguments, word for word. And in winter, a plastic sheet over the bedroom window was the only thing keeping the cold from eating the room alive. She packed what little she owned into 2 duffel bags. A framed photograph of her father, Anthony Romano, smiling in front of a warehouse that no longer existed. A box of sheet music yellowed at the edges that she had not touched in a decade. Her mother's rosary. 3 uniforms that no longer fit any job she'd ever have again. She looked around the apartment one last time and felt nothing like sadness. She felt like a soldier leaving a foxhole for the front line. The car that came for her was black, long, and silent, driven by a man who did not speak the entire ride to Oyster Bay. The Moretti estate rose out of the storm like something built to intimidate the sea itself. Iron gates 12 feet high, a driveway of raked white gravel that curved past manicured hedges toward a stone mansion perched on ocean cliffs, its windows glowing gold against the dark water beyond. Armed men stood at intervals along the wall, trying and failing to look like landscapers. Inside, marble floors stretched in every direction, veined black and white, cold beneath Beatrice's shoes. Renaissance-era paintings hung in gilded frames along the hallway. A saint in agony, a Madonna with tired eyes, a battle scene rendered in oils centuries old. A grand staircase curved up toward the 2nd floor like something out of an old film. Beatrice had expected to be humiliated here. She had braced herself, walking through those gates, for whispered jokes among the staff, for a bedroom shoved in some forgotten wing, for Domenico to treat her like an exotic curiosity he'd won on a bet and would soon grow tired of. Instead, The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Adele, showed her to a suite on the second floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the cliffs and the churning gray Atlantic beyond. "Mr. Moretti asked that your room be prepared with the largest bed in the east wing," Adele said, folding her hands. "He said you should never feel cramped in your own home." Beatrice stared at her. "He said that?" "He said a great many things," Adele replied, and something almost like sympathy flickered across her face before she turned to leave. The couture fitting happened 2 days later, in a sunlit room on the 3rd floor that had been converted into something like a private atelier. A stylist named Renata, thin, sharp-featured, visibly displeased with her assignment, unfurled a corset onto a dress form and gestured for Beatrice to step behind the changing screen. "We'll want to create a waist," Renata said crisply, snapping the boning straight. "Cinch here, structure through the bodice. Once we compress the midsection, the silhouette will read much more elegant." Beatrice stepped into the corset with the practiced resignation of a woman who had done this before, at other fittings in other lives. Renata pulled the laces. The air left Beatrice's lungs in a rush. The boning dug into her ribs, into her stomach, crushing inward until stars sparked at the edges of her vision. "A little tighter," Renata muttered, tugging again, "and we'll really create that hourglass." "I can't," Beatrice gasped. "I can't breathe. Just a moment more. We're almost." The door opened. Domenico stood in the frame, still in his shirt sleeves, a folder of shipping documents under one arm. He took one look at Beatrice's face, pale, gasping, hands braced against the dress form, and his expression went utterly cold. "Stop," he said. Renata's fingers froze on the laces. "Take it off her," Domenico said. "Now." Renata scrambled to loosen the corset. Beatrice sucked in a full breath, ribs aching, humiliation burning hot in her cheeks. "I was only trying to create a flattering," Renata began. "You were trying to make her smaller," Domenico said, voice quiet and lethal. "I did not hire you to shrink her. I hired you to dress her." He stepped further into the room. "You're finished here. Collect your things." Renata's mouth opened, closed, and she fled without another word. Beatrice stood there, corset loosened around her ribs, staring at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Domenico said simply. "I did." He crossed the room, retrieved a phone from his pocket, and made a call right there in front of her. "Get me Vittoria De Luca," he said into the phone. "Yes, the one in the village. Tell her I need a gown designed for a woman who deserves to be seen, not hidden." He hung up and looked at Beatrice. "Do not shrink her to make other people comfortable," he said. And Beatrice realized, with a jolt, that he was repeating the instruction he'd just given the phone. Repeating it for her benefit so she would understand exactly what he meant. 3 days later, an elderly woman named Vittoria De Luca arrived with a team of assistants and bolts of deep emerald silk. She did not measure Beatrice the way Renata had, with barely concealed distaste. She measured her the way a sculptor studies marble, with respect for the material. "Your shoulders," Vittoria murmured, running careful fingers along the seam line, "are magnificent. We'll cut to show them." "Your waist," she paused, considering. "We frame it. We don't hide it. We never hide it." When the gown was finished 2 weeks later, Beatrice stood in front of a full-length mirror for the first time in years without immediately looking away. The emerald silk fell over her broad shoulders and settled against her heavy hips like it had been poured there. The bodice cinched gently at her natural waist without crushing it. The skirt moved when she did, a slow, deliberate sweep of fabric that made her feel, for one dizzying moment, like something powerful instead of something apologized for. She stared at her own reflection and did not recognize the feeling rising in her chest. It took her a long moment to name it: pride. That evening, Domenico found her in the music room, a vaulted chamber on the ground floor with a grand piano, walls lined with vinyl records and sheet music, and acoustics designed, she suspected, specifically for this purpose. He was standing near the record player when she entered, a glass of wine in his hand. "Sing something," he said. Beatrice's spine went rigid. No, she expected him to press. Every man she had ever known who wanted something pressed until he got it. Instead, Domenico simply nodded, once, and gestured toward the leather armchair beside his own. "Then sit," he said. He placed a record on the turntable, callous again, singing Bellini this time, and sat down across from her, and they listened together in silence as the storm outside rattled softly against the windows. Beatrice watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile the man who had placed a gun on a wine-stained tablecloth with the man who now sat with his eyes closed, utterly still, lost in the same music that had once nearly gotten Camilla killed. She reminded herself, silently, forcefully, "This is a Moretti. This is the man whose family burned your father's warehouse. This is the enemy." But it was getting harder, each day, to believe it with her whole chest. The chair incident happened the following week. Beatrice came down to breakfast to find the dining chair she usually used, a narrow, antique piece with delicate armrests, replaced by a wider, more substantial chair upholstered in deep burgundy leather. Heat rushed to her face immediately. "You replaced my chair." Domenico glanced up from his newspaper. "Yes, because you think I'm going to break the old one." "No." He set the paper down, meeting her eyes directly. "Because the old chair was narrow, and you looked uncomfortable in it every morning, and I have 300 chairs in storage that would fit you better." This was the closest to hand. Beatrice opened her mouth to argue and found she had nothing to say. He never asked her to eat less. He never mentioned her size at all. Not once. Not even in the careful, coded way people sometimes did. "Have you thought about?" Or, "There's a wonderful trainer I know." The phrases she had absorbed like acid over the years. He simply removed obstacles as he found them, without comment, without apparent expectation of gratitude. It confused her more than cruelty ever had. The days blurred together in a strange, suspended rhythm. Fittings, music, quiet dinners where Domenico spoke of shipping routes and family business, with a careful, deliberate vagueness that told Beatrice he trusted her only so far. Which stung, though she told herself it shouldn't, since she was lying to him about everything that mattered. He was attracted to her. She could see it in the way his eyes lingered when he thought she wasn't watching, in the careful, controlled way he touched her hand at the end of each evening and pressed his lips to her knuckles before retreating to his own wing of the house. He never pushed further. He never demanded intimacy he hadn't earned. It made the guilt worse, not better, because every night, alone in her enormous bed overlooking the black ocean, Beatrice reminded herself of the file she needed to find. The black ledger. The proof that would let her finally understand, finally avenge, what had happened to her father. "This is revenge," she told herself, staring at the ceiling. "Not this, not the chair, not the gown, not the way he listens to me breathe when the opera plays. Revenge." She almost believed it. 3 days before the wedding, a call came in the middle of the night. Beatrice heard Domenico's low, urgent voice through the wall of the adjoining study, heard the words docks and shipment and now. And by the time she came downstairs in her robe, his car was already pulling away from the gate. taillights swallowed by the storm. Adele told her he wouldn't be back until morning. Beatrice stood at the window, watching the empty driveway, and felt her heart begin to pound with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite excitement. This was her opportunity. For 2 weeks, she had memorized the rhythm of the house without anyone noticing. The guard rotations. A man posted at the east door every night from 11 to 3, replaced by a different man for the dawn shift. The blind spots in the security cameras along the west corridor, where an old support beam blocked half the lens. Domenico's habits, the way he always paused in front of the portrait of his grandfather in the study, adjusting it slightly, as if checking something behind the frame. At 2 a.m., Beatrice slipped out of her room in bare feet, moving through the dark house like a shadow among shadows. The study door was unlocked. Domenico trusted his own home, at least, a mistake she intended to use. She crossed to the portrait of his grandfather, a stern-faced man in an old black-and-white photograph, and pulled the frame gently away from the wall. The safe behind it had a digital keypad, 6 numbers. She had watched him once, weeks ago, through the reflection in the study window, while he thought she was reading in the garden below. She had seen the ghost pattern of his fingers moving across glass. She had memorized it, without fully understanding what she was memorizing, filing it away, the way she filed away everything now, patient and precise. She typed the sequence. The lock clicked. The safe swung open, and Beatrice's breath caught at what lay inside. Stacks of bearer bonds. A velvet pouch of loose diamonds that caught the study's dim light. Leather dossiers, thick with paper. Financial ledgers bound in dark green leather. Not the black ledger she'd been hunting for, but close enough that her pulse spiked. She began pulling files, scanning names, searching for anything connected to Anthony Romano, to the warehouse, to the fire that had ended one life and hollowed out another. Near the bottom of the stack, her fingers closed on a manila folder, thinner than the others. She opened it. Asterisk. Anthony Romano. Stgazed. Asterisk. Beatrice's knees nearly buckled. She sank onto the edge of Domenico's desk, the folder trembling in her hands, 10 years of grief rising in her throat all at once. I found it. I found the proof. But as she turned the pages, surveillance photographs, grainy and time-stamped, of men standing outside her father's warehouse the night it burned. Something in the images didn't match what she'd expected. She studied the faces. She had memorized the Moretti soldiers' faces years ago, cross-referencing old newspaper photographs, court records, whatever scraps she could find. These men were not Moretti soldiers. She flipped to the next photograph. A different night, a different location, a diner parking lot. Lorenzo, Domenico's underboss, handing an envelope to a man in an NYPD captain's uniform. Beatrice's stomach dropped. She kept flipping, faster now, her mind racing to reassemble 10 years of certainty into something new and terrifying. Looking for something, Songbird? The voice came from the darkness near the door, and the study lights flared on before Beatrice could move. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, a pistol held loosely at his side, his stone face arranged into something almost like amusement. "You've been busy," Lorenzo said, stepping into the room. The door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final click. 2 weeks of watching guard rotations. Very patient, very thorough. I almost respect it. Beatrice's hand tightened around the folder. "You killed my father." "Your father," Lorenzo said, tilting his head. "Controlled independent port routes that I needed. He was moving legitimate cargo through channels that could have carried a great deal more than legitimate cargo if he'd only cooperated. I asked him nicely, twice. He refused, Beatrice whispered. He refused. Lorenzo's mouth curled, so I removed the obstacle, and I made sure the ashes pointed toward the Morettis instead of toward me. It wasn't difficult. Two families already circling each other, looking for an excuse. I gave them one. He shrugged, almost bored by his own confession. The chaos that followed was useful. While Domenico's father spent 2 years chasing ghosts and burying soldiers, I built something quieter. Captains who answered to me instead of him. Half his organization, Songbird, half of it belongs to me now, and he doesn't even know it. Beatrice felt the 10 years of grief inside her curdle into something colder, sharper. You let me hate the wrong family for 10 years. I let you hate exactly who I wanted you to hate. Lorenzo raised the pistol, almost lazily, and pointed it at her chest. I ran your fingerprints the day you started working at that restaurant, Songbird. Domenico's little pet project, the waitress who sings. I knew who you were before you ever poured his wine. I let you play your little game because it was useful to me too. Tonight, even more so. What are you talking about? You're going to die in this study, Lorenzo said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. And I'm going to plant a certain black ledger near your body. The one you've been searching for so diligently. Domenico will find you here, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and he will believe, in his grief, that the woman he fell in love with was sent to destroy him. His smile widened. A man that broken makes mistakes, gives orders that don't hold, and while he's drowning in that grief, I take what's left of his organization without firing another shot. Beatrice's pulse hammered in her throat, but she did not step back. She did not raise her hands. She planted her strong legs on the marble floor, the same legs that had carried trays for 6 years without complaint, and drew a long, deep breath. A singer's breath, drawn from somewhere beneath the fear. Any last songs, Songbird? Lorenzo asked, almost gently, finger tightening on the trigger. Beatrice looked him dead in the eye. You spent 10 years making me hate the wrong man, she said, voice steady as stone. The French doors behind Lorenzo exploded inward in a shower of glass and rain-soaked wind. Domenico came through them like something unleashed. The first shot went wide, shattering a lamp near the bookshelf. Lorenzo spun, firing back, and the study erupted into chaos. The crack of gunfire swallowed by rolling thunder outside, glass raining from a shattered window, ocean wind tearing through the room and scattering papers like startled birds. Get down! Domenico shouted, diving behind an overturned settee as a bullet splintered the mahogany desk beside him. Beatrice dropped low, the folder still clutched against her chest, crawling toward the shelter of a heavy bookcase as bullets tore through the air above her. She came here to destroy you. Lorenzo bellowed from behind the desk, firing another shot. She's been planning it for months, Domenico. Ask her why she's really in your house. I know, Domenico shouted back, and something in his voice made Beatrice's whole body go still, even in the middle of the gunfight. He knows. She stared across the wreckage of the study at him, crouched behind the settee, blood already darkening the sleeve of his shirt where a bullet had grazed his forearm, and understood with sick, dawning clarity that this was not the moment he'd learned her secret. This was the moment he confirmed he'd known it all along. I've known for 3 years, Domenico called, ducking as another shot splintered the wood above his head. I know your name is Beatrice Romano. I know what you believe happened to your father. I know exactly why you took a job at that restaurant. You, Canoe. Beatrice's voice cracked across the chaos, raw with betrayal. Not now, he shouted, and rolled from behind the settee to return fire at Lorenzo, forcing the older man to duck behind the desk. An opera record shattered against the wall, vinyl shards scattering across the marble. A framed painting crashed down, its canvas torn by a stray bullet. The room that had once held quiet evenings of shared silence now looked like a battlefield. Two of Lorenzo's men burst through the study door, guns already raised. Domenico spun, firing twice, dropping one before he'd cleared the threshold. The second man swung his weapon toward Domenico's exposed flank, his blind side, where broken glass and smoke obscured his vision. Beatrice saw him first. She did not hide. She did not scream a warning that would come too late. She rose from behind the bookcase and ran. 260 pounds of momentum, of strength built from years of carrying weight, the world told her was shameful, crashed into the gunman's side like a landslide. He went down hard, the shot meant for Domenico's back tearing harmlessly into the ceiling in a shower of plaster. Beatrice's body, the body that had been mocked, measured, and diminished her entire life, became the thing that saved him. She wrestled the gun from the stunned man's grip, driving her elbow down hard, and he went still beneath her. She looked up, chest heaving, just in time to see Lorenzo rise from behind the desk. Gun leveled at the back of Domenico's head, who was still turned toward the fallen soldier, unaware. There was no time to shout a warning that would reach him before the trigger. Beatrice's eyes fell on the bronze opera statue on the study's side table, a small figure of a soprano mid-note, arms raised, that Domenico had shown her once with quiet pride, a piece from Milan. She grabbed it and threw with everything her body had left. The statue struck Lorenzo across the temple with a sickening crack. He staggered, gun discharging harmlessly into the floor, and collapsed against the desk, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence fell over the ruined study, broken only by the storm still raging beyond the shattered doors. Domenico lowered his weapon slowly, chest heaving, and turned to find Beatrice standing amid the wreckage. Hair loose, dress torn at the shoulder, a smear of someone else's blood on her cheek, the bronze statue's pedestal still gripped in one trembling hand. He crossed the room without a word and pulled her against him. His hands, when they came up to cradle her face, were shaking. "You're safe," he said, voice breaking on the words. "You're safe. You're safe." Beatrice realized with a jolt that went through her whole body that the terror radiating off him wasn't for himself. He had walked through gunfire without flinching. But now, holding her, his hands trembled like a man standing at the edge of losing everything that mattered. She let herself lean into him for one long, unguarded moment. Then she pulled back. "Don't," she said. "Don't hold me like that until you tell me the truth. All of it." Domenico's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Your father and I worked together," he said, "for almost a year before he died. He wanted the port unions clean, no corruption, no narcotics moving through his roots. I wanted the same thing, for different reasons. My father's organization was drowning in Lorenzo's ambitions even then, and I needed allies I could trust outside the family." He looked away, toward the shattered window, rain still hammering the broken glass. "Anthony was one of the only honest men I ever did business with. We were close to exposing Lorenzo's narcotics operation when your father was killed. I couldn't prove it was Lorenzo. Not without starting a war inside my own organization that I wasn't ready to win. So I buried what I knew. And I promised your father, the last time I spoke to him, that if anything ever happened to him, I would find his daughter and protect her." "You, Knu," Beatrice said again, quieter now, the anger burning colder. "You knew I believed your family murdered him. You let me believe it." I needed your hatred to be real, Domenico said. Lorenzo has spies in every corner of my life, Beatrice. If I had told you the truth the moment I found you, if I had shown you even a flicker of what I felt, Lorenzo would have noticed. He would have known something was wrong. He would have moved against both of us before I had the leverage to stop him. So you used me. Yes. The word landed like a slap, honest and unflinching. Beatrice's hand rose and struck him across the face before she'd fully decided to do it. Domenico did not flinch away. He did not raise a hand to his cheek. He simply stood there and absorbed it, eyes still locked on hers. You had no right, Beatrice said, voice shaking, to turn my grief into strategy, to turn my father's death into a chess piece. 10 years, Domenico. 10 years I hated the wrong man because it was useful to you that I did. No, Domenico said quietly. I didn't have the right, you're correct. He did not defend himself further. He did not explain it away. He simply stood in the wreckage of his own study, blood drying on his sleeve, and let her anger exist without trying to smother it. The coup collapsed within 48 hours. With Lorenzo restrained and his network exposed by the files Beatrice had found, Domenico moved fast and without mercy through the captains who'd been quietly loyal to his underboss. There was no dramatic bloodbath. Domenico had learned, apparently, that surgical precision served him better than spectacle. 3 captains disappeared from the organization's ledgers entirely. The rest fell back into line, chastened, watching their boss with new and careful respect. Beatrice watched all of it from a distance, numb, cycling between fury and something that felt uncomfortably close to grief for a version of Domenico she'd allowed herself to believe in. On the 3rd night, she packed her 2 duffel bags, the same ones she'd carried from Queens, and began folding what few things she'd let herself accumulate here. The emerald gown, her father's rosary, the sheet music she still hadn't been able to touch. She was zipping the 2nd bag when the door opened. Domenico stood in the frame, no longer in the blood-stained shirt, dressed simply now, his expression unreadable. He did not block the door. He did not order her to stay. He crossed the room and set a thick folder on the bed beside her half-packed bags. Anthony Romano's complete file, he said. Everything Lorenzo compiled. Everything I've gathered since. Financial records, property deeds. The accounts your father held before the warehouse burned, most of it still there, untouched, waiting for the right signature. He set a 2nd folder beside the first. You came here to destroy me, Beatrice. If you still want to, this is more than enough. Every piece of evidence you'd need to bring this entire organization down is in those 2 folders. Beatrice stared at the files, then at him. What about the wedding? Domenico reached into his jacket and withdrew the engagement ring. A deep emerald stone set in gold, chosen, she suspected now, to match the gown he'd insisted be made for her, and placed it gently on the table beside the folders. There is no wedding, he said, unless you choose it. There is no marriage built on a debt you never agreed to owe me. He stepped back toward the door. I've made enough decisions for you, Beatrice. I won't make this one. He left without another word, and the door clicked shut softly behind him. Beatrice sat alone in the enormous bedroom. Rain ticking softly against the windows, now that the storm had begun to pass, and looked at the 4 objects arranged before her, like a life laid out for judgment. The engagement ring, catching the lamplight. Her father's file, thick with the truth she'd spent 10 years hunting. Her old sheet music, yellowed and untouched. The emerald gown, hanging in the open closet, waiting. She thought about the version of herself who had walked through those iron gates 8 months ago. with revenge sitting cold and certain in her chest. That woman had a plan. Find the ledger, expose the Morettus, burn it all down and walk away whole. But the ledger she'd found had pointed somewhere else entirely, and the man she'd come to destroy had spent 3 years quietly protecting her, badly, imperfectly, in ways that had cost her something real along the way, but protecting her nonetheless. She thought about the chair he'd replaced without being asked, the stylist he'd fired on sight, the way he'd said, "Do not shrink her to make other people comfortable," to a phone, in front of her, so she would understand the words weren't performance. She thought about the bronze statue in her hand, the weight of her own body slamming into a gunman twice, the moment her size, the thing the world had spent a lifetime apologizing for, had become the exact thing that saved a man's life. Revenge had brought her into this mansion. It was not, she realized, sitting there in the quiet aftermath of everything, the reason she wanted to stay. But wanting to stay and being ready to forgive were not the same thing, and Beatrice would not confuse the two. Not for him, not for anyone. 3 days later, St. Patrick's Cathedral stood draped in its own kind of stormlight, gray clouds pressing low over the Manhattan skyline as black cars lined up along Fifth Avenue. Inside, the vaulted ceiling soared into shadow, stained glass, casting fractured color across rows of pews filled with the surviving captains of the Moretti organization. Men in dark suits, watching, waiting, wondering whether the wedding they'd been summoned to would happen at all. Word had spread of the study, of Lorenzo, of Beatrice Romano's true name, and the file she'd found. Some of the men whispered that the wedding was already dead, that no boss recovered from a bride who'd once planned his destruction. Domenico stood at the altar in a black suit, hands folded, spine straight, and did not look toward the door. He genuinely did not know if she would come. The organ began its slow, mournful prelude. Minutes passed. The whispers among the captains grew louder, more pointed. A few exchanged glances that suggested bets were quietly being settled. Domenico remained still, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point past the altar, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of watching him wait and fail. Then the great cathedral doors opened. Beatrice stood framed in the entrance, backlit by gray Manhattan daylight, and the entire cathedral seemed to inhale at once. She did not wear white. She did not wear anything designed to make her smaller, too slim, a silhouette that had never needed slimming. She wore crimson and gold, a dramatic gown that swept from her shoulders to the floor in bold, unapologetic lines, the fabric catching the stained glass light and throwing it back in fire and amber. Her shoulders were bare and broad and magnificent, her waist framed rather than crushed. Every inch of her filled the doorway like she had been built specifically to stand in it. She looked regal. She looked powerful. She looked, for the first time in a decade, entirely unashamed of the space she occupied. But Beatrice did not walk down the aisle. She stood at the threshold, and she began to sing. The first note rose through the cathedral's cavernous stone, filling every arch and column, climbing toward the vaulted ceiling like something reaching for heaven itself. This was not Vissi d'arte. There was no grief in this voice, no decade of buried humiliation. This aria soared, bright, triumphant, alive with a joy that seemed to shake loose from every corner of the ancient stone. Where the first song had been pain given sound, this one was victory given voice. It was choice. It was rebirth. It was a woman who had once been told to make herself smaller, standing in the largest cathedral in the city, filling it entirely. The captains in the pews rose slowly to their feet, one after another, without being told to. Domenico stood frozen at the altar, watching her, and something in his carved, controlled face finally, fully broke open. Beatrice began to walk. She moved down the aisle with the same unhurried certainty that had carried her through 6 years of aching shifts, through a burning warehouse and a hidden safe and a gunfight that should have killed her, her voice never wavering, filling the space between them, note by note until the final, soaring phrase rang out and settled into silence just as she reached the altar steps. The cathedral held its breath. "I am not marrying you because of a wager," Beatrice said, voice steady, carrying clearly through the vast stone silence. "I know," Domenico said. "I am not your rescue. I know. I am not your weakness." Domenico's gaze moved, briefly, over the rows of captains watching them both, men who had spent their entire careers believing strength meant never needing anyone. Then his eyes came back to her. "No," he said. "You are the one person in this room strong enough to stand beside me." Beatrice held his gaze, unflinching. "Then understand something, Moretti," she said. "We run this together, not behind me, not in front of me, beside me. If you ever decide my life is a decision you get to make alone again." "I won't," Domenico said, before she could finish. "Never again." Beatrice studied his face for a long moment, searching, she realized, not for a lie, but for the courage to finally believe there wasn't one. She found it. "Finally," Domenico said softly, and something like real relief broke through his composure, at last. They married beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Patrick's Cathedral as the gray afternoon light shifted through stained glass and painted them both in color. When Domenico kissed her, gently, reverently, his hands framing her face the way they had the night of the gunfight, only without the fear this time. The captains in the pews lowered their heads, not because their boss had ordered it, because the woman they had once dismissed, sight unseen as nothing more than a fat waitress, had become impossible to look away from. Outside, as the newlyweds descended the cathedral steps into a city still damp from days of storm, Beatrice paused and looked back once at the great stone doors behind her. The same doors she'd stood framed in, uncertain only minutes before. The world had spent years trying to make her smaller. Smaller body, smaller voice, smaller dreams, a smaller life, folded into the corners of restaurants and apartments and expectations that never once considered. There might be room for someone built the way she was built. Domenico Moretti had been the first man to tell everyone around her to stop shrinking her. The stylist, the chairmakers, a room full of armed men who learned, one gunshot at a time, exactly how dangerous underestimating her could be. But Beatrice understood something now, standing on those cathedral steps in crimson and gold, her husband's hand warm in hers, that no wager and no ring could have given her. She had not become powerful because a mafia boss chose her. She had become powerful the moment she stopped shrinking herself. They had mocked her body. It became the strength that saved a man's life. They had ignored her voice. It became the sound that silenced an entire cathedral. They had underestimated her grief. It became the fire that burned through 10 years of lies and found the truth waiting on the other side. In the end, all three had become weapons. And Beatrice Romano, no longer hidden, no longer apologizing, no longer small, walked down the last of the cathedral steps, into a life she had chosen for herself on her own terms, at last. Would you have forgiven Domenico for the way he manipulated Beatrice? Even knowing he was trying to protect her, was Beatrice right to walk into the Moretti mansion seeking revenge? And which moment hit you hardest? Beatrice's opera performance in that first stormy dining room, the discovery that Lorenzo killed her father, or her return to the cathedral in crimson and gold? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more cinematic romance sagas, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they were never too much. They were just waiting for the world to make room.